So if you've been here the past few weeks, you know that we've been speaking about some of our Unitarian forebears, Channing, Emerson, and this week I wanted to speak to you about Theodore Parker. Let me show you this. If you can see this, it might look backwards to you, I'm not sure, but that's what Theodore Parker looked like. And I was fortunate yesterday to receive this in the mail. I managed to find one, and this is called a carte de visite. And carte de visites, one expert says, were the first social media ever in the United States. They were photos of people, usually prominent people, but other people had them as well. And they became a real fad, a real rage, and you would give those to people when you went to visit them. So, for example, if I had a carte de visite and I went to visit one of you, I would give you my carte de visite, and you would be fortunate enough to have a photo of me. Woo. And they might give you a picture of them on a carte de visite. And people actually traded and collected these things. And that was Theodore Parker. He was not above a little vanity to have his own carte de visite. But that carte de visite is an original from around 1858 or so, a couple of years before his death. He's, as you'll find out, is one of my favorite Unitarians. So I'll be framing that and hanging it on my office space wall soon. He was born 211 years ago on August 24th, just a couple of days from now, in 1810 in Lexington, Massachusetts. And he was the grandson of Captain John Parker, who led the forces on Lexington Green and touching off the Revolutionary War in 1775. People described Parker as a teenager as raw and rough, emotional and poetic, roguish, versatile and witty, and he was very smart. He excelled in school at academics, and he got an early education through country schools and through his personal study. He worked on a farm, he lived on a farm, and so when farm chores allowed, he tutored himself in math and in Latin and in other subjects. So at 17, he began teaching in local schools. And he continued tutoring himself in advanced and specialized subjects. So he learned Hebrew, actually. He learned that from Jonathan Sages, who was the son of a famous Rabbi, Gershom Sages, and who had been baptized as a convert to Christianity. He also studied for a time under Converse Francis, another Unitarian and Transcendentalist, and who preached at Parker's ordination. In 1830, when he was 19 years old, Parker walked 10 miles from Lexington to Cambridge to apply for Harvard College. And he was accepted, but he couldn't pay the tuition. So they allowed him to live and study at home, where he continued to work on his father's farm. And he only joined his classmates when there was an exam. And he completed 3 years of study at Harvard College in 1 year. Then he took various jobs, various posts as a teacher, conducting an academy from 1831 to 1804 in Watertown, Massachusetts, where his late mother's family had lived. And at Watertown, he met his future wife, Lydia Dodge Cabot, and he announced their engagement to his father, and they were married 4 years later on April 20th, 1837. While he was living in Watertown, he wrote and he produced his first major manuscript called The History of the Jews, which outlined not so much the history of the Jews as it outlined his skepticism at the description of the biblical miracles in the Hebrew scriptures. And it was a liberal approach to the Bible. He thought about becoming a lawyer, but he was really such a man of faith that he decided to study theology. And he entered Harvard Divinity School in 1834. And he specialized in the study of German theology and was drawn to the ideas also of Coleridge and Emerson and Carlyle. And he wrote with some fluency and spoke with fluency in various languages, including Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and German. But he also studied Chaldee and Syriac and Arabic and Coptic and Ethiopic. So this is a man of many, many talents. He graduated in 1836 from Harvard Divinity School, and he was ordained in 1837 as the minister of the West Roxbury Unitarian Church in Massachusetts. Now, in those days, accepted doctrine among Unitarians called for the use of reason. We've been talking a lot about this the past few weeks. We've been talking about it for the past couple of sessions in our history discussion, UU history. And it called for the use of reason in determining religious truths. Every person could find God in his or her own way by simply reasoning through the idea of God. But these truths had to be supplemented, Unitarians believed then, by further revelation, especially through the study of the miracles of the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. And when Parker started to publicly question those truths or the truth of the miracle stories and began to interpret them as natural occurrences, other Unitarian ministers started to shun him. They started to push him away and called him dangerous. And they even tried to sever all ministerial ties with him. Based on the ideas that he gleaned from German scholarship, I mentioned previously, the German higher criticism that was sweeping across Europe, he began to see the stories of the Bible not so much as historically true, but as myth, narrative that conveys basic truths, but within a poetic and metaphorical form. I talk about the idea of myth in the scriptures all the time. He spoke of Jesus not as uniquely divine, but as a great teacher who was inspired in the same manner that we can all be inspired. Jesus, he said, had simply been able to open himself to a truth greater than to a greater degree than the rest of us. The religion that Jesus preached was not made authoritative by the messenger. We spoke about this on Thursday night at our UU history thing. He said that the religion that Jesus preached was not made authoritative by the messenger who preached it. The religion that Jesus preached was authoritative on its own because it was a natural religion, an absolute religion that had much less to do with the nature of Jesus than with the nature of those things that are true in all places and in all ages. Love, kindness, loving your fellow man, loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind, all of those things. He went on to play a very pivotal role in moving Unitarianism away from a Bible-centered faith. And in 1841, he gave an ordination sermon entitled "The Discourse on the Transient and Permanent in Christianity." And this set him as a major figure in the Transcendentalist movement and part of what later became known as the Transcendentalist controversy within Unitarianism. Transcendentalists believed that truth could be found in many places, that truth was all around us, particularly in the experience of nature. That's why Transcendentalists were very often involved in things like botany and science, the various sciences, zoology, all of those things. But they also found truth in poetry and in literature and in art. And Parker spoke about the mythic quality of the miracle stories And he denied outright the authority of the Bible and the authority of Jesus, and that that authority they did have rested on miraculous events. He denied those things. Let me read to you something that he said. He said, Christianity does not rest on the infallible authority of the New Testament. It depends on this collection of books for the historical statement of its facts. In this, we do not require infallible inspiration on the part of the writers, more than in the record of other historical facts. I cannot see that it depends on the personal authority of Jesus. He was the organ through which the infinite spoke. So if it could be proved, as it cannot, in opposition to the greatest amount of historical evidence ever collected on any similar point, that the Gospels were the fabrication of designing and artful men, that Jesus had never lived, still, Christianity would stand firm and fear no evil. If Christianity were true, we should still think it was so, not because its record was written by infallible pens, nor because it was lived out by an infallible teacher, but that it is true like the axioms of geometry, because it is true and is to be tried by the oracle God places in the breast. If it rests on the personal authority of Jesus alone, then there is no certainty of its truth. In other words, we spoke about this the other night. If Jesus had never lived, but people had written those words, they would still be true because we somehow connect to them, we relate to them, we understand them, that love and caring for other people and self-sacrifice are important virtues that we should hold and aspire to. Well, when he gave that sermon, Trinitarians attacked him, of course. They said he was a heretic, and by association, all other Unitarians were heretics as well. And the Unitarians attacked him more in response to their being upset with him than the attacks of the Trinitarians. And they wrote him off as unchristian, and they stopped exchanging pulpits with him. That was a common thing back then. They would often travel to different churches and exchange pulpits every now and then. The Unitarian Ministers Association even tried to remove him from their fellowship, and they asked him to resign, but he refused because he believed that he could still work with them and had a mission to them. But the controversies continued. They didn't go away. And yet they were responsible for helping him to become one of the most famous preachers in America. In January of 1845, a large group of his supporters gathered at Marlborough Chapel in Boston, and they decided to give Parker a chance to be heard. They called themselves the Friends of Theodore Parker, and so they hired a hall, and they invited him to preach on Sunday mornings. He wasn't crazy about the idea, but he did, and he accepted. And it was temporary at first, but eventually he resigned his West Roxbury church, and he started this new congregation with these people. They call it the 28th Congregational Society of Boston, Massachusetts. Today, that's known as the Theodore Parker Unitarian Church in Boston. And in that congregation, the 28th Congregational Church in Boston, grew to 2,000 people, which was at the time 3% of Boston's population. Think about that. That's a pretty big slice of Boston's population for one church. And they included people like Louisa May Alcott, William Lloyd Garrison, Julia Ward Howe, who was a personal friend of him. You remember Julia Ward Howe, she wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton called his sermons soul satisfying. And she credited him with introducing her to the idea of a heavenly mother within the Trinity, which makes sense to me, right? Parker was increasingly known for preaching what he and his followers identified as a type of prophetic Christian social activism. He was involved with almost all of the reform movements of his day: peace, temperance, education, women's rights, legislation, reform of penal legislation, prison discipline, in other words, changing how prisoners were treated in prison, and the issue of poverty. But only one really became, I mean, they were all important to him, but the one that became really the most important to him was abolition, his anti-slavery views. He denounced the Mexican War, and he called on his fellow Bostonians to, in 1847, to protest against this most infamous war. And he exposed racism against Mexicans by the people who called them inferior. But his abolitionism became the most controversial thing about him. And he wrote in 1848 a scathing pamphlet called "To the Southern Slaveholder." And that heated up the abolitionist crisis. He advocated violating the fugitive slave law in 1850, which was part of the Compromise of 1850, if you remember your history, which required the return of escaped slaves to their owners. And he worked with a lot of fugitive slaves, some of whom were even members of his congregation. And as in the case of two people, William and Ellen Craft, he hid them in his home. And when he was found out, he was indicted for his actions, but he was never convicted. As he grew older, he became even more radical in his views and in his actions. It's said that when Parker was sitting in his office, when he was writing his sermons or doing work in his office, he sat there with a loaded gun on his desk in case he needed to run out and try to stop someone from capturing a fugitive slave. As Unitarians today, we might find that a bit much, but it wasn't so back in 1850. He also became a member of something called, which later became known as the Secret Six. These were 6 men who supported John Brown's revolt, if you remember, at Harper's Ferry. And they provided the funds to buy the ammunition and all that stuff. And he was a member of those 6 men. And all but one of those men were Unitarians, and 2 of them were Unitarian ministers, Parker and one other man. He wrote a public letter after John Brown's arrest called "John Brown's Expedition Reviewed." And he even argued for the right of slaves to kill their masters if they needed to escape. And he defended Brown's actions. Again, as Unitarians today, we might find that a bit much. I have to be honest, I'm not sure how I would have felt back in 1850. And he continued his work until he was forced to retire in 1859 because he contracted tuberculosis. There wasn't an effective treatment available in the United States at the time. So he left the United States and he moved to Florence, Italy. A lot of transcendentalists had a fascination with Italy, and he went there to be in the company of his friends Elizabeth and Robert Browning. But he died there on May 10th, 1860, which is only about a month less than a month after he arrived there. He's buried at the American Cemetery in Florence. Maybe you remember years back when President Obama gave the media and the American people a tour of the newly redecorated Oval Office when he moved in there. And there was this newly woven rug. Do you remember that rug he had around the floor there? This newly woven rug. And around the edge of the rug are 5 quotations. Allegedly, they're from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and Presidents Kennedy, Lincoln, and both Teddy and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they're great quotes. They're wonderful quotes, especially the ones attributed to Dr. King. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And President Lincoln's a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But those two quotations are misattributed on the White House rug because they're really the words of Theodore Parker. The exact quote by Parker, those exact quotes are longer. For the first one that Martin Luther King used, Parker said this. He said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." And that was from an 1853 sermon entitled "Of Justice and the Conscience." And if you read about Martin Luther King, if you read as he was studying and as he was in university and divinity school, when he was early on in his career, he read a lot of Unitarian material. And in fact, he and Coretta considered becoming Unitarians. But they felt that their work was better done in the African American community, which was not so much involved at that point in the Unitarian community. And so he was familiar with the work of Theodore Parker. And that's where he paraphrased his quotation from. And then Parker penned the words, "A government of all the people, by all the people, for all the people," in a speech that he gave in 1850. And back then it was common for these kinds of speeches to be published in newspapers or in pamphlets and distributed around the country. And even though there's no record of Parker and Lincoln ever meeting face to face, Lincoln was obviously familiar with Parker's words, and he nicked a few of them for his own in the Gettysburg Address. I confess that of the three people I've spoken about in the last three sermons, Parker is my favorite. Channing and Emerson are very important, of course, in our Unitarian history, and I enjoy reading them, and especially the two sermons that we spoke about, Channing's Unitarian Christianity and Emerson's Divinity School Address. I hope that at some point, if you haven't already, maybe you'll go online, you can go on the internet and find both of those and read them through. They're really important. They form the foundation, I think, of our liberal tradition's values and our theology, such as it is. But Parker seems to me, anyway, more of a kindred spirit, just as most of the transcendentalists of his generation appeal to me as well. I like to think that if Parker had grown up at the same time that I did, or many of us did, he would have been just as radical as we were back then in protesting the war in Vietnam and getting out on campus and fighting for civil rights. I think he would have been just as involved. And I mean, come on, look at that beard. It's a great beard. I might just do that, although Lisa won't let me shave my mustache. Parker reminds us that spirituality is not just navel gazing. It isn't just reading and studying sacred texts or spouting platitudes from them. It's not just sitting in meditation. It's not just trying to find enlightenment. It's taking those texts and speaking and acting prophetically. Martin Luther King did that. We should too. And may it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.